writers, members of the Tamil Nadu Progressive Writers Association, comrades and friends. It's a pleasure for me to be associated with this particular event where there has been an in-depth analysis of the education policy that has been suggested, and that too by a very distinguished scholar. I have unfortunately not been able to read the book properly because I think it was released only yesterday. To me, what was sent was an advanced copy by email, which I have glanced through, but I don't feel competent to talk about the book as such. I shall refer to points in the book from time to time, but let me say a little bit in general about the education policy that has been, the draft education policy that is now being discussed. Basically, when Gandhiji launched his civil disobedience movement, he asked students in school, in colleges, universities and so on, to give up their education and to come out. In justification for this, he said that the education that was being given to them in the English colleges and universities, English-started colleges and universities, is something which was basically meant to prepare them to be servitors of the British Raj. That kind of education is something that they better do without. Rather, what he wanted was education which would produce people who, in my language, which I borrow from Antonio Gramsci, would produce organic intellectuals of free India. And he felt that the kind of educational institutions that existed at the time were intrinsically incapable of producing the organic intellectuals of free India, which is why he wanted them to come out of it. Now, obviously, it is implicit in what Gandhiji said that education is not a homogeneous thing. You cannot just say that there is something called education which is being given irrespective of what institutions we are talking about, irrespective of what context we are talking about, and so on. Obviously, the kind of education which needs to be imparted, which is imparted in the social interest at any point of time, is something which changes from one point of time to another. Now, this has several implications. Obviously, one implication is that the education which is imparted in India cannot simply be a replica of the education that is imparted, say, in a university like Harvard or Cambridge or anything. That basically, if you have an educational institution here, that educational institution cannot just be a clone of the educational institution that may be in the United States or in Britain or anything of that kind. I'll give you an example. For instance, I believe in my subject economics, every Indian student should know a little bit about our own economic history. Therefore should know something about colonialism, and therefore should know something about, let's say, a man called Dadabhai Nauroji, who wrote about colonialism. But on the other hand, you go to Harvard, nobody would have heard of Dadabhai Nauroji. You go to Cambridge, nobody would have heard of Dadabhai Nauroji. So if you have a curriculum which simply replicates what is being taught in the advanced capitalist countries in an education institution in India, in that case one is doing a fundamental disservice to the Indian society. Now, there is a second implication of what Gandhiji had in mind, and that implication is that the educational institutions must not produce self-centered, self-absorbed, self-obsessed bourgeois individuals, because bourgeois individuals are supposed to be basically looking after their own interests, but the purpose of the education system should be to produce people who are sensitive to their environment, who are sensitive to the society in which they live, who are sensitive to the people, to the needs of that society in which they live. If this is the case, then we should have a set of educational institutions which are very different, which are sui generis, which are completely specific to the kind of requirements that we have. If they're going to produce the organic intellectuals of free India, if they're going to produce intellectuals for free India, which no matter what their discipline, which no matter whether they are scientists or social scientists or specialists in humanities, would nonetheless be having certain common characteristics of being socially sensitive, should be having some common characteristics of prizing the freedom of their people above anything else and defending that freedom above anything else. Now, if this is the purpose, then we should be clear that this idea, which informed in some ways, very imperfect ways, the setting up of the educational system after independence, at least this was the thinking which underlay the setting up of the educational system after independence, is something which is under attack today. It is under attack from two distinct directions. One is the direction of international capital. International capital would like our educational institutions basically to produce cannon fodder for its own profit-making machinery. And therefore, it is interested in the commoditization of education. Education should actually be a commodity, because the people coming out of the education system, themselves being commodities who go to the highest bidders and who think of nothing else but their own selves, and they measure their own worth in terms of the money that they command in the market, which is the meaning of a commodity, that basically if the products of the education system are a commodity, are commodities, then the education that goes into them, the education that is embodied in them, should also be inevitably become a commodity. Therefore, we have on the one hand a threat to the production of organic intellectuals of free India, which comes from international capital. International capital is interested in the skills you have. International capital is not interested in the thoughts you have. Therefore, the first challenge to the production of organic intellectuals of a free India arises from the side of international capital that would rather destroy thought in order to produce skills. The second kind of challenge comes from the Hindutva forces. The project of the Hindutva forces, creating a Hindu state, requires a whole lot of an ideological structure, an entire ideological structure. An entire ideological structure, for instance, which blames the minority, which blames the hapless minority, the Muslims, for the ills of contemporary India. And it does, for it to do so, it must be the case that people must be willing to accept it. Now, if people are unwilling to accept it, in that case the Hindutva project gets stalled. Therefore, for the advancement of the Hindutva project, you require a destruction of thought. You require a destruction of reason, which is why at the moment there are all these attacks on institutions of higher learning. That if you take Jawaharlal Nehru University, my own university, if you take Hyderabad Central University, if you take Pune Film Institute, just name any distinguished place, any distinguished center of learning today is under attack. Why? Because the Hindutva project requires a destruction of thought. It requires a destruction of reason. It requires the promotion of unreason, where people do not believe in, or do not insist upon evidence before accepting propositions. Therefore, the project of developing an education system which would cater to the need to produce organic intellectuals of a free India, faces today a twin challenge. One is from the side of international capital, which through the process of globalization is seriously interfering in our education system. The other is from the side of Hindutva, which is in the process of attacking all the institutions that have been set up since independence, which are worth something. Now, this corporate Hindutva project of trying to destroy thought is something which is now being given an official imprimatur in this draft National Education Committee report. This National Education Committee report is something which carries forward that particular idea of really, the corporate Hindutva project of destruction of thought, destruction of reason, destruction of or destruction of the project of developing organic intellectuals of a free India. Now, how does it do? There are many different aspects, many different ways in which it does so. One very obvious way, which has attracted a lot of attention in Tamil Nadu, is of course its language policy. Now,